Think like a philosopher, move like a warrior, live like a monk. Machiavelli's dominance formula. Hook. Before we begin, if this kind of content speaks to your soul, if you believe that wisdom is the sharpest weapon a person can carry, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell, because what we build here, week after week, is not content. It is transformation. Now let us get into it. Opening. There is a man history cannot ignore. A man who wrote with such ruthless clarity that kings feared his books even after his death. A man who was imprisoned, tortured, stripped of everything, and still found a way to see the world more clearly than almost anyone who ever lived. That man is Niccolo Machiavelli. Most people only know his name as an insult. Machiavellian. They say, and they mean cold, manipulative, devious. But that is a shallow reading of a profound mind. Machiavelli was not teaching cruelty. He was teaching truth. He looked at the world not as it should be, but as it is, and from that unflinching gaze, he forged a philosophy that still burns with relevance today. This video is not a history lesson. It is a formula, a framework built from Machiavelli's deepest insights, woven together with the timeless wisdom of philosophers, warriors, and monks. By the time we are done, you will have a new operating system, a way of thinking, moving, and living that puts you in command of your own fate. The foundation. Why most people never rise. Let us begin with a question Machiavelli himself would have asked. Why do most people never reach the life they are capable of living? It is not lack of talent. It is not lack of opportunity. Machiavelli understood something brutal and beautiful about human nature. Most people are conquered not by their enemies, but by their own hesitation. They wait for the perfect moment. They wait for permission. They wait for the world to make things easier. And the world, as Machiavelli knew well, never does. He wrote that fortune is like a river in flood. It devastates everything in its path when there are no embankments to hold it, but when men have built their defenses in times of calm, when the storm arrives, it causes little harm. In other words, the unprepared suffer. The prepared prevail. This is not pessimism. It is the call to prepare. To build your inner embankments before the flood arrives. The philosopher prepares with thought. The warrior prepares with action. The monk prepares with stillness. And Machiavelli's dominance formula asks you to be all three, not in sequence, but simultaneously. Not as a performance, but as a way of being. The first pillar. Think like a philosopher. Machiavelli was, before anything else, a thinker. He observed. He read. He reflected. He spent years studying the great men and great failures of history, not out of academic interest, but because he understood that the patterns of the past are the prophecies of the future. To think like a philosopher in the Machiavellian sense is not to sit in an ivory tower debating abstractions. It is to see reality with absolute precision. It is to strip away the comfortable illusions you have built around your situation and look, unflinchingly, at what is actually there. Most people live inside the stories they tell themselves. They tell themselves they are not ready. They tell themselves the timing is wrong. They tell themselves that other people have advantages they do not. Machiavelli would have no patience for this. He wrote that men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that anyone who seeks to deceive them will always find someone who will allow it. The deceiver he was speaking of is not just the cunning leader in a palace. It is the voice in your own head that deceives you daily. Philosophical thinking, in the truest sense, is the practice of catching yourself in your own deceits. It is asking, what is actually true here, as opposed to what I want to be true? It is sitting with the discomfort of an honest answer. The great Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, practiced this same discipline. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who ruled the most powerful empire in the world, still began each morning by reminding himself of the difficulty ahead. Not to be pessimistic, but to be awake. To be philosophical is to be awake in a world that rewards sleepwalking. Think about the decisions you have been avoiding. Think about the situations you have been misreading because the truth was inconvenient. Think about what you already know that you have been refusing to act on. The philosopher does not flinch from these questions. The philosopher leans into them, because on the other side of honest seeing is the power to respond rather than react. Machiavelli wrote that the wise man does at once what the fool does finally. This is the philosopher's advantage. They see the inevitability of things before the crowd does, and they move first. Not rashly, but deliberately. Not blindly, but with the clarity that comes from having done the difficult inner work of genuine understanding. To think like a philosopher is to become the author of your own understanding rather than the passive reader of whatever narrative the world hands you. It is to ask, always, what is true? What is real? What does this moment actually require of me? The second pillar. Move like a warrior. Thinking without action is daydreaming in an expensive costume. Machiavelli knew this better than most. He was not merely a man of letters. He served Florence in diplomatic and military roles, navigating some of the most treacherous political terrain of Renaissance Italy. He understood that at some point, the thinking must stop and the moving must begin. The warrior archetype is ancient. It runs through every great tradition: the samurai, the Spartan, the knight, the Stoic soldier. But moving like a warrior does not mean moving with aggression. It means moving with decisiveness, with courage, and with discipline. Machiavelli admired the Roman general Cesare Borgia, not because Borgia was good in any moral sense, but because Borgia was effective. Borgia moved. He made decisions when decisions needed to be made. He did not allow the fog of uncertainty to paralyze him. He chose a direction and moved with the full force of his will. Machiavelli watched this and called it virtù, a word he used in a very specific way. Not virtue in the Christian sense. Not kindness or humility. Virtù meant excellence, capacity, power, the quality of a person who could shape events rather than merely endure them. The warrior lives with urgency. Not panic. Urgency. There is a difference. Panic is reactive, scattered, driven by fear. Urgency is focused, deliberate, driven by purpose. The warrior wakes each morning knowing that the day is a battlefield, that it will demand something real, and that shrinking from that demand is a form of death. A slow one, but death nonetheless. One of the most powerful things Machiavelli ever wrote was this: never attempt to win by force what can be won by strategy, but when strategy has been exhausted, do not hesitate to use force. In the context of your daily life, this means, be intelligent first, be patient when patience serves you. But when the moment for action arrives, do not hesitate. Hesitation is the enemy of the warrior. Hesitation is where potential goes to die. Moving like a warrior also means accepting pain. Not seeking it, not celebrating it, but refusing to let it stop you. Every worthwhile goal carries a burden. The discipline of waking early. The discomfort of difficult conversations. The exhaustion of sustained effort. The warrior does not ask why the burden exists. The warrior shoulders it and moves. Think about the goal you have been circling for months or years. You know what needs to happen. You know the first step, the second step, the uncomfortable conversation, the risk that must be taken. What you may be lacking is the warrior's willingness to move despite the discomfort. The warrior does not wait to feel ready. The warrior moves, and readiness comes through the moving. Your life is not waiting for you to be comfortable. It is waiting for you to be courageous. The third pillar. Live like a monk. And now we come to the element most people miss entirely when they read Machiavelli. Because in all his talk of power and strategy, Machiavelli was profoundly aware of the internal dimension. The ruler who cannot govern himself cannot govern anything. The person who is enslaved to appetites, to reactivity, to the noise of the crowd, that person is not powerful. That person is a puppet. To live like a monk is not to renounce the world. Machiavelli himself was deeply engaged with the world. He wanted power, recognition, influence. Living like a monk, in this context, means living with an inner quality that transcends the chaos of external circumstance. It means cultivating silence. It means protecting your attention. It means refusing to be ruled by impulse, comfort, or the validation of others. The monk understands something the hustler never quite grasps, that the quality of your inner life determines the quality of everything you produce in the outer one. A mind that is scattered produces scattered results. A mind that is still, that is focused, that has learned to be present without being pulled in 1,000 directions, that mind is an instrument of extraordinary power. Machiavelli spent years in exile at his farm in Sant'Andrea in Percussina after being stripped of his position in Florence. He described his routine in a letter to his friend Francesco Vittori. He would spend his mornings doing ordinary rural tasks. Then in the afternoon he would enter his study, change into his robes of court, and spend hours in conversation with the great men of antiquity, reading their histories, absorbing their wisdom, thinking. He said those hours were his only real joy, and he could not live without them. Here was a man who had lost everything, and yet he had built an inner sanctuary that exile could not touch. That is the monk's gift, the ability to find richness inside regardless of what is happening outside. Living like a monk also means intentionality with your environment. The monk does not fill every moment with noise. The monk allows silence. The monk prunes what is unnecessary, unnecessary relationships, unnecessary consumption, unnecessary ambition that is really just the hunger for approval in disguise. What remains after that pruning is something lean and true and powerful. Consider your own daily life. How much of it is spent in genuine engagement with what matters, and how much is spent in distraction, in reaction, in the noise of things that will not matter in a year? The monk asks this question daily, not as self-punishment, but as an act of respect for the finite hours of a human life. Machiavelli understood that a man without inner discipline is at the mercy of fortune. He wrote that the one who relies on fortune falls when it changes. But the one who has cultivated inner strength, who does not need fortune's favor to maintain their dignity, that person endures through every season. The integration, where the three pillars become one. Now here is where the formula becomes alive. Because the philosopher, the warrior, and the monk are not three separate people. They are three dimensions of a single integrated human being. And Machiavelli's dominance formula is the art of holding all three simultaneously. The philosopher without the warrior becomes an armchair observer, brilliant but impotent. The warrior without the philosopher becomes a brute, powerful but blind. The warrior without the monk becomes a machine, effective in the short term, hollow in the long. The monk without the warrior becomes passive, peaceful but irrelevant. You need all three. You need the clarity of the philosopher to see what is true. You need the courage of the warrior to act on what you see. You need the stillness of the monk to do both of those things sustainably, from a place of depth rather than desperation. The people who move through the world with what we might call presence, that quality that certain individuals carry where they seem fully alive, fully intentional, fully themselves, they are almost always living all three of these dimensions. They have done the inner work of honest self-examination. They have the courage to act in alignment with what they know. And they have developed a quality of stillness that allows them to be in the noise of the world without being consumed by it. Machiavelli's own life is the proof of concept. Even when he was tortured, even when he was exiled and forgotten, he never stopped thinking, never stopped writing, never stopped believing in the power of his own mind to make sense of the world. The discourses, The Prince, The Art of War, all written in exile. All produced by a man who had every reason to collapse and chose, instead, to think, to create, to move. Applying the formula. What this looks like in your life. So how do you actually live this? Because a philosophy without application is just beautiful noise. The philosopher's practice begins in the morning. Before the phone. Before the notifications. Before the world rushes in with its demands. 5 minutes. Just 5. Of sitting with your own mind. Asking yourself, what do I actually know about my situation right now? What am I avoiding seeing? What truth am I aware of that I have been too comfortable to act on? This is not meditation in the formal sense. It is simply honest self-confrontation. It is Machiavelli's clarity applied to your own life. The warrior's practice is the commitment you make and keep. Not the goals you write in a journal and revisit when you are feeling inspired. The commitment you honor when you are tired, when no one is watching, when the easiest thing would be to stop. Choose one thing, one goal, one practice, one relationship, and show up for it with warrior consistency. Not perfect consistency, consistent consistency. The warrior falls. The warrior gets up, the warrior moves again. The monk's practice is the one most people resist most, the practice of subtraction. Each week, identify one thing that is consuming your attention without giving anything back. One habit, one relationship, one consumption pattern, one obligation taken on out of guilt rather than genuine desire. And release it not dramatically. Just quietly, intentionally, release it. The monk's power comes from what is removed as much as what is cultivated. When you clear the clutter from your inner life, what remains is extraordinary. And then, because Machiavelli above all else was a man who understood the importance of preparation, build your embankments now. Do not wait for the flood to think about how you will respond. Build your philosophy now, in the calm days. Build your warrior discipline now, before the crisis. Build your inner monastery now, before the noise gets louder. Because it will get louder. That is the nature of life. The question is whether you are built to withstand it. The deeper truth. Fortune favors the prepared soul. Machiavelli is famous for saying that fortune is the arbiter of half our actions, but that the other half is left to us. People often quote the first half and forget the second. They remember that fortune is powerful. They forget that they are, too. Half of your life is circumstance. Family you were born into, timing, the accidents of history, the moment you happen to meet certain people. That half, you cannot control. But the other half, the response to circumstance, the preparation, the quality of your thinking, the depth of your commitment, the integrity of your inner life, that half is entirely yours. Most people live as though the percentage is reversed. They act as though 90% of their life is determined by circumstance and 10% by their choices. Machiavelli would call this an abdication. It is the decision to be governed rather than to govern. And while governments can be benevolent, circumstance rarely is. The philosopher, the warrior, and the monk each represent a reclamation of that 50%. The philosopher reclaims the mind from default thinking. The warrior reclaims action from default comfort. The monk reclaims attention from default noise. Together, they constitute a life of active authorship, the refusal to be simply a character in someone else's story. This is not arrogance. Machiavelli was keenly aware of human limitation. He knew that even the wisest and most capable person can be undone by events beyond their control. But he also knew that the person who has done the work, who has thought clearly, moved courageously, and lived with inner discipline, that person will find a way. Not always the expected way. Not always the comfortable way. But a way. The legacy. What Machiavelli actually wanted. Here is something that gets lost in the popular reading of Machiavelli. He was not a man who celebrated ruthlessness for its own sake. He was a man who loved Florence, his city, with a depth of feeling that breaks the heart. He spent his life trying to help her. He watched her be dominated by foreign powers again and again. He watched capable men fail because they were not willing to see reality as it was. He watched idealists be crushed by realists. The Prince was not a manual for tyrants. It was a diagnosis, and in some readings, a desperate plea. Look at what is actually happening, Machiavelli was saying. Look at what actually works. Stop being conquered by your own innocence. What he wanted, for Florence, for the princes he advised, for anyone who would listen, was genuine flourishing. Strength, not for its own sake, but as the foundation of a life and a society worth inhabiting. He wanted people to be free. And he understood that freedom requires power. Not domination over others, power over circumstances, power over one's own fear and inertia and comfortable self-deception. That is what his formula offers you. Not a method of manipulation. A method of liberation. Think clearly enough to see what is true. Move courageously enough to act on it. Live deeply enough that the storms of fortune cannot take your center from you. Closing. The invitation. You are alive at an extraordinary moment. A moment of extraordinary noise, extraordinary distraction, extraordinary pressure to be ordinary, to consume, to react, to disappear into the crowd. And within that moment, you have a choice that every human being in every era has faced. The choice to be shaped or to shape. The choice to be governed or to govern. The choice to sleepwalk or to wake. Machiavelli made his choice in a dungeon. In pain. In disgrace. He came out of that dungeon and wrote one of the most influential books in the history of political thought. He had no platform, no followers, no guarantee that anyone would ever read a word he wrote. He thought like a philosopher. He moved like a warrior. He lived, in his small study in exile, like a monk. And the world remembered him. You do not need to change the world to justify this formula. You only need to apply it to your own life, your own days, your own decision about who you are going to be when circumstances press you. That is enough. That, in fact, is everything. Think clearly, move courageously, live deeply. That is Machiavelli's dominance formula. And it is yours to use. Subscribe. Call to action. If this spoke to something real in you, if you felt something shift while listening, then I want to invite you to become a permanent part of what we are building here. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell, because every week, we go deep into the lives and philosophies of the greatest minds in human history, not to admire them from a distance, but to extract what is usable, what is transformative, what can change the way you think and the way you live right now. We are building a community of people who refuse to be ordinary. People who believe that wisdom is the most practical tool a human being can carry. People who are done being spectators and are ready to be authors of their own existence. This channel is for you. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs it, and I will see you in the next one. Think like a philosopher. Move like a warrior. Live like a monk.